When the Wilderness Act passed in 1964, and by the way, passed unanimously in the Senate and with one dissenting vote in the House of Representatives, one dissenting vote. Old Joe Poole from Texas was the only guy who said no. To have that sort of consensus is stunning. It was stunning then, but now it would be almost inconceivable. I can't imagine a topic that would generate that sort of support. I, at the time, was 8 years old, living in a tiny house in northern Indiana, blue-collar neighborhood, neck deep in the corn and the rust. And I was doing everything I could to get out and explore on foot and by bike, and hanging out at the hedgerows along the cornfields looking for foxes, and hanging out in the hardwoods and eating persimmons and raspberries. And my parents were very supportive of me being out in the natural world, and I deeply appreciate them for that. But sometimes I think we forget what was going on. The sort of abuse is the only word I can really think of that was going on to so much of the land in the United States at that time. In that decade, there would be 1 billion pounds of DDT spread just in the farmlands between Mississippi and Minnesota. My brother and I used to swim in boat channels and ponds in northern Indiana. Didn't know any better, and I remember every spring we would talk about how this sweet tang was coming from the water, which was actually a sheet of dioxin that was sprayed on to get rid of the weeds. That dioxin was concentrated up north of where I grew up and put into barrels and turned into Agent Orange and sent to Vietnam about the same time. So there were mercury and lead levels really on the rise, and birth defects in the poorest neighborhoods next to industrial zones in Chicago and New Jersey and Louisiana, lots of that stuff. And so I think that it was the reaction against this sort of blustery living that created this so-called modern environmental movement, modern conservation movement. Within 10 years of the Wilderness Act being passed, we had a Clean Air Act, we had a Clean Water Act, National Environmental Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, and to a large extent all of this, I think, was the result of people just being fed up with the land being abused in that way. But when it came to the Wilderness Act, while it was a reaction against that sort of abuse as well, I think something else was going on, and it's that something else that I wanted to talk to you this morning about. That something else has to do with the fact that it wasn't just a simple reaction to the bluster. It was a nod to how important the wildlands had been to our sense of who we were as a country, as a nation. These wealthy young women suffragists who in the 1890s and early 1900s came out west and found a kind of freedom and respect for them as people that didn't seem to be existing in their high society life, where they go to these summer resorts and have to not sweat and wear certain kinds of clothing. There was something called the language of the fans in the 1880s and 90s, where if you were a young single woman, you were not supposed to engage men directly. You would hold your fan to the right side of your face if it meant yes, and left side if you were saying no. And it was just ridiculous. And they came out to these dude ranches in the Rockies, and these cowboys are saying, what? This is nuts. So it got so popular that finally the New York Times said, in addition to all these other places that a well-bred young woman needed to experience in the world, she should also spend at least 4 to 6 weeks in a Rocky Mountain dude ranch. And Susan B. Anthony in the 1800s said that she tried to coordinate a big group of suffragists to come out and move to Wyoming Territory, because Wyoming Territory in 1869 had passed a suffrage act and refused to come into the Union unless women were given the right to vote. And that was 50 years before women were given the right to vote. So, it was selective, and I don't want to portray the Rockies as the den of equality for everyone, but it was really an outstanding place to not only escape the confines of civilization, literally, but to escape those confines of social mores and rigid roles that you were expected to play. So I ask, what will you do with the rhythms of the wild, that kind of creative force that guided in the hands of those artists in Chauvet Cave 38,000 years ago, that that kind of rhythm and urgency that in the early 19th century led to this fantastic 3-year-long debate among the clergy of Eastern America about whether nature was the hand and voice of God or whether nature was God himself. That force that allowed fresh life to seep into that brilliant, broken group of kids I followed through southern Utah a dozen years ago. What will you do with that?